We are now in my little tiny library, which is basically one cabinet and one shelf unit. And I have here some of the most interesting finds that I've made during the course of 11 years of research. And if it's not interesting to people now, I thought it might be interesting in the future if a Matthew Franklin Whittier and Abby Poyen Whittier library or museum is ever established. It might be kind of fun to have me presenting and showing some of these items which would be in the museum at that time. So in no particular order, I'm just kind of going to grab these things and show them to you. One of the coolest is this, and it says on the top, engraved in it, I'll put some close-ups on these things, it says, "The small carved box enclosed belonged to John Greenleaf Whittier." And when you open it, you find that there is indeed a little tiny box in this smaller box, and in that are two little tiny carvings. They may be ivory, they may be something else. They look like deer. They're actually chamois, and those are like a combination of a deer and a goat that lives in the Alps. And the story behind these, and I'm almost 100% sure of this, is that Matthew, writing as quails for the Boston Weekly Museum, which was not Ocean Dodge, went to Europe and took a tour of Europe after he had attended the World Peace Congress in Exeter Hall in London, which we'll get to in a minute. And he apparently bought these little teensy-weensy chamois as, I would guess, Christmas presents for his sister, his little sister, Elizabeth. And they got passed down when she died in 1864. They became John Greenleaf Whittier's, and then they got passed down further. And eventually, I think they ended up with John Townsend Trowbridge, who was a friend of the Whittier family. And this was purchased somewhere near Arlington, Massachusetts, which was John Townsend Trowbridge's home. But Matthew talked about these as quails. He mentions, he doesn't say he bought them, but he talks about the exquisitely small half-inch carvings of animals and other things that he seemed to be under the impression that lots of people made these carvings, but I can't find any examples online at all that small. So I'm guessing it was one particularly talented artist and not that people in Switzerland just generally did that. So anyway, he talks about them as quails, and putting two and two together, since this ended up in the Whittier family, the most likely thing is that Matthew purchased them for Elizabeth. There's another possibility. There was a fellow named Bayard Taylor who was a travelogue writer and adventurer, and he was personal friends with Elizabeth. So conceivably, they could have come from him. But since Matthew as Quails writes about them, I think it's pretty definite. So that was kind of fun because I bought them before I found the passage in Quails that talks about them. So I sort of bought them on spec. You know, I put a minimum bid on the thing and nobody else bid on it, and I won it, which is very suspicious. Now, speaking of Exeter Hall, I've shared this before, but there's going to be a lot of duplication here. I've touched on many of these things piecemeal. I found, wait a minute, I've got to make sure it doesn't fall. I found in the Illustrated London News a full-page illustration of the opening of the World Peace Congress in Exeter Hall. And Quails tells us that he is in the reporter's box, which, you know, I mean, it's going to be absolutely proven that Ocean Dodge wasn't the author. So I feel, from Abby, I feel like, you know, that's going to be overkill. So this is definitely Matthew Franklin Whittier. And if this is very detailed, he must have drawn it with a loupe. So if you zoom way in on the reporter's box, you will see Matthew with a characteristic loop on the left side in his hair, gazing up at the speaker. He's the only person in the reporter's box who is not reporting because he works for an American newspaper, literary newspaper, and he's writing a travelogue, and he's not really required to write this speech down verbatim. So of all the, I think there's 9 or so people in the reporter's box, he's the only one that's looking up, and it is Matthew. Now, I mentioned that there is a little loop of hair on the left-hand side that's in that portrait. It also shows up in this etching of Matthew which is the first image of Matthew Franklin Whittier I ever saw, the one where I looked into his eyes, where I saw it online, and knew immediately that that was him. Well, it's in this book, Whittier's Works, Life and Letters, by Picard, Samuel Picard. And on some of the editions, not all of them, the fancier ones, it's on page 32. And in this etching, which is based on a photograph, which I also have a copy of, I don't have the original, I believe that's in the February 5, 1899 edition of the Boston Herald. I can't get a copy of it, but that's where the photograph is printed. But anyway, that same loop of hair is in this portrait. Let's see. This is kind of fun while we're on the subject of portraits. This is a CDV, they call it, Carte de Vista, and it is of Matthew Franklin Whittier as a young man around age 33, something like that. And I can't go into proof in this presentation. You know, there's just not enough time. I can touch on proof elements occasionally. This came from, let's see, Dudley Miller. I'm missing a name. That might be his middle name. Jarrett Smith's son-in-law. It came from his photograph album. And Matthew and the Whittiers were friends with Jarrett Smith. So the upshot of it is that instead of this being a possible Matthew out of the entire United States, it's an extremely probable, if not definite, Matthew out of somebody's photo album that was a personal friend. See, so this is, and then you compare this. There's an oil portrait from about the same era, and it's definitely Matthew. So this is not an original. That would have been a daguerreotype, and this one, of course, is a copy. You can see how small it is. It's probably because the original daguerreotype was I can't remember what divisions they come in, 6th, 9th, whatever, like a 6th portrait. So that's Matthew Franklin Whittier, which I have. But then we have this. I have it in a Pier 1 glass box. This is a miniature portrait. And this is a very strange bird because this came from Montevideo, Uruguay. And I've put a cardboard backing on it because it didn't have a backing. If you look at it, it's hard to tell if it's original or a copy. It may be a copy. But when I looked at this image, this is a young man of about 18. And I looked at the eyes and I said, well, that may not be photo accurate. I mean, for one thing, they always made everybody's mouth smaller as a matter of flattery. And they probably straightened his nose out a little bit. But I swear this is me. I mean, this is Matthew Franklin Whittier as a young man of 18. And it would have been around the time that he was writing for and editing the New York Constellation, around 1832, somewhere around there. So he's 20 or maybe a little younger, 18, 19, something like that. And the way it could have gotten to Montevideo is that he had been to sea at one point when he was much younger. He could have a friend that's a sailor. And when that sailor got into New York, came into town, they would go out on the town. And one of the things you would do when you go out on the town would be to have your portraits done and swap portraits so that he took Matthew's portrait and Matthew took his. It's a token of remembrance. So if this is probably a copy or possibly the original of a miniature that was done in New York when they were having a night on the town in maybe 1830, 31, 32, this could be Matthew Franklin Whittier, especially if he put on a bit of weight relative to this image. So I don't know. That's in the I don't know category. It seems like it's a real stretch. This is a case where my intuition is screaming at me. I look at those eyes and I know his attitude and I know everything about him emotionally. See, I have full emotional recall. And the cockiness and the intelligence and the feeling that he had the world by the tail, you know, at that age. Here he was editing a New York newspaper at like age 18, you know. So I feel that looking at that. It's like that. It's either somebody very much like Matthew or that is Matthew Franklin Whittier. So it's interesting. It's not anything I can prove. Let's see here. We're going to skip around a bit. This is the Essayist, which I've shown recently. This was a monthly, although it was erratic, a monthly magazine, young man's magazine in Boston. And Matthew's work, signing as Franklin Jr. and also signing as the star, his star signature, is in here. Matthew did reviews as the star, and he did reviews later as the star for the New York Tribune, and that body of work has been attributed to Margaret Fuller. But see, Matthew had been writing reviews as the star many years earlier, so I don't know if you can see it. That's a page that has a lengthy review. Should I read any of it? He's talking about Caspar Hauser, an account of an individual kept in a dungeon, separated from all communication with the world from early childhood to about the age of 17. This would have been something that would have fascinated Matthew at this age, philosophically. And he says, this is a work of no little interest. The account of one who, from earliest infancy, had for some mysterious reason been confined to a lonesome dungeon, shut out from all communication with the world. His fiendish keeper was to him unknown, and though great pains have been taken by the judicial authorities of Nuremberg to trace the perpetrator of this base transaction, it is still covered by the veil of inscrutable mystery. It is not our purpose in a notice like this, I want to get to the philosophical part. It is not our purpose in a notice like this to give a detail of his biography. And he goes on a little bit like that. Then he says, we will mention one instance in the development of his mental powers, which is somewhat remarkable. We will give the incident in the author's own words. And I don't want to read all of that too. So he closes like this. We will add but one word more. We think this book of peculiar interest to the metaphysical student. Here we have one who, for 17 years, was kept from all the influence and example of the world. What then was the result? Had his mind retained an unspotted purity, or had the seeds of depravity shot up with wild luxuriance? We will let President Tennerbach speak for us. Quote, he no longer retains, says that eminent writer, anything that is extraordinary, but his extraordinary fate, his indescribable goodness, and the exceeding amiableness of his disposition, signed with a star. So this is the philosophically inclined, metaphysically inclined, star-signing author that one sees in the 1844-1846 New York Tribune, which was mistakenly claimed by and attributed to Margaret Fuller. It was never Margaret Fuller. It was always Matthew, signing as the star, writing in exactly the same vein, in exactly the same style, back in 1832-33. Now, what else do we have here? This is American Review. This is 1845, the first half of the year, American Review. In this book, and I will not tell you how much it cost me, is The Raven, as it was submitted by Matthew Franklin Whittier, signing blank Quarles, which I think stood secretly for Abby Quarles, which was a little inside joke. But Abby, I think in particular, was a strong fan of Frances Quarles, and she was a brilliant debater. You just couldn't beat her in an argument. And they would have not arguments about the toast or anything like that. They would have arguments or discussions about things like, was St. Paul, genuine, which now I realize he was not. And Abby probably took that position, and Matthew argued vehemently with her about it because he defended St. Paul, and she was right. As a matter of fact, every argument I can think of that we had, she was right. Now, as I've been able to ferret them out. Anyway, The Raven is in here as it was submitted to American Review, probably for the very first premiere edition, and it didn't get in until the second one, written by and submitted by Matthew Franklin Whittier. It also contains Some Words with a Mummy, which Matthew also wrote, and Poe stole, both of them, but Poe submitted that one. It was supposed to appear in the February edition, 1845, of this Columbian magazine. It says, I don't know if I can find it, in the To Correspondence column in the first edition, he says that it's going to appear. Let's see, I'll thumb through and I'll edit out my, here we are, page 45, Notice to Correspondence. The following articles are accepted, viz. Death of Marco Bozzaris, The Deaf Girl in Church, Tears, The Double Ruse, An Hour in the Nursery, Highland Adventurer, To a Transplanted Flower, First Love, and Some Words with a Mummy, but it never appeared. What did appear is a description of an illustration of Benjamin Franklin doing his kite experiment, which I am 99% sure was written by Matthew Franklin Whittier, that and a couple other illustration descriptions. So for some reason, instead of Some Words with a Mummy appearing as it was supposed to, 3 of Matthew's descriptions of illustrations appeared instead. Why, I have no idea. I could hazard a guess that Edgar Allan Poe got word that it was going to get published in there. He had his finger on the pulse. And he said, oh, that's mine. You can't write it. I'm going to submit it to American Review. That's not this other person's work. And, of course, lied about it. That's how devious Edgar Allan Poe was. People have not caught up to how devious the man was. So that's my guess. But there's the 2 publications, the one it should have been in and the one that it ended up in. Now this is a little book of La Fontaine's fables. This is written for young people. It's called La Fontaine, A Present for the Young. It's published in 1839, I believe. And this was put together by Matthew and Abby. I believe that Matthew had as one of his homework assignments. Abby tutored him for many years, both from a distance and also in person. If you want to know what their tutoring relationship was like, read Wine of Cyprus, that's supposedly written by Elizabeth Barrett, the future Elizabeth Barrett Browning. It was not. It was written by Matthew about their tutoring sessions, and I can prove it. I've got a paper on that subject. But this would have been just a little sample, basically. According to the preface, they planned on a bigger, version for adults, but they were just kind of floating this literally as a trial balloon, as they said. And it was registered by J.S. Wright. I don't know what relationship J.S. Wright had to Elijah Wright, but this, I'm quite sure, was done by Matthew and Abby. And in fact, they seem to alternate, the ones that Abby loved and the ones that Matthew loved. You can kind of pick out whose was which. So that's another little interesting piece. I've got 2 copies of that. This is the Portland, White Mountains, and Montreal Railroad Guide, which Matthew wrote for a friend of his, S.B. Beckett, who was also an author in Portland. And they were members of the Spiritualist Association, so they knew each other. I think Beckett had money. But this was ghost written by Matthew. His style is all through this. It's quite obvious. But what's remarkable about this one is that this is the proof copy. And it has Matthew's full writing, unadulterated writing in it. And it has presumably Beckett's comments in pencil. I think you maybe can see them up in the margin there. Beautifully, beautifully written. It's like, if Shakespeare wrote a manual, for a little extra cash or something. Not to be grandiose, but I mean, it's really a piece of literature that's written for, a kind of a, not exactly an advertisement, but it's designed to induce people, I think, to travel on the railroad and so on and give them a guide. So anyway, that was a find for me because I've got, as opposed to buying one that was published later on, this is the proof and it has all of Matthew's text in it. This, I've gone over this too. I can't open it because I'm in the process of repairing the spine. This is what they called an album, which is, kind of like nowadays if a kid breaks his arm, everybody will sign on it, or, in a yearbook, all the kids will get their friends to sign their yearbook picture. Well, that's what this was. Your friend would usually put a poem in here, either their own poem or somebody else's poem, something they probably had prepared, and some of them are sappy and some of them are excellent. Matthew wrote something which apparently seems to have been attributed to a minister named Edward H. Chapin. And that poem, the same poem called The Beautiful, is first published, as near as I can tell, in Rose of Sharon, which was an annual compilation. This is the 1842 volume, and the poem appears in the very, very, very back of this, called The Beautiful. And this is, I would say, much better than The Raven. This is one of his best poems, if not his best. And Chapin was really not that good a poet on his own steam. He could not have written this. Just like so many of these things, the people that claim these works, if you look into them and see what else they've written, if you look at Charles Dickens and see the other Christmas stories that he wrote after Christmas Carol, he couldn't possibly have written a Christmas Carol. The same goes with The Raven. You look at Eulalame, for example. The person that wrote Eulalame as a kind of a knockoff did not write The Raven, and these things are obvious, or should be obvious. Well, the person that wrote The Beautiful did not write the hymns and things that Edward Chapin wrote. This is a magnificent poem. I've read the entire thing through. I won't do it now. But some lines from this poem are used by Matthew in this album. And he puts his name underneath. He does not attribute it to E.H. Chapin. And at first, when I found this first, it bothered me. I thought, why didn't he attribute it to Chapin? I mean, I know it's for an album, but normally he's pretty careful about that. Well, he didn't attribute it to Chapin because Chapin didn't write it. He wrote it, So he put lines of his own poem some years after 42, see? So he knew that it was officially attributed to Chapin. So he wrote the poem, and then underneath, he's got his own name. Let's see, I can't open the book, but I've got a copy of it here, a photocopy. So he ends with the last line of the poem, "The beautiful lives in the depths of the soul," and it's quoted. And then he has affectionately your classmate, and then his signature. So he's left it ambiguous as to whether that poem is his or not, see? Deliberately ambiguous, I would say. So what else do we have here? This here is a little boy's novel. And this was written in 1863. And it's called Harry Lee, Harrie, which was a way to distinguish a child from an adult, put the IE ending. Harry Lee, or The Tempter and the Tempted, a story for boys. But this, uncharacteristically, is signed with Matthew's full initials, MFW. He used his full name, or his real name, back in like 1842, 43. Then, with one exception, he stopped doing that. And this is the first time he comes back and actually uses his full name. Now, why he did that, I don't know. This was 63's in the middle of the Civil War, but I think maybe he felt that he couldn't get in any serious trouble for that. People would say, oh, he's keeping out of trouble. He's just writing children's books. It's on a theme that's very relevant to Matthew personally, because as a young man, he was adversely influenced by his peer group. So that's what this whole story is about, is a young man his mother dies, and he's bitter about his mother's death, and he gets led astray by the bad boys, and gets into really serious trouble. One interesting thing about this is there's a description of a near-death experience in this book, couched as a dream, but it reads just like the modern near-death experiences. Moody would look at it and say, oh, here's this element, and this element, and this element of a near-death experience, including being healed. So that's pretty interesting. This is the Pathfinder Railway Printing Establishment on North 5th Washington Street in Boston. Not this actual one, but this is the little booklet that Matthew used to travel around as a postal inspector during, say, 1849 to 1852. It's the same period when he went to Europe, but he was writing his quails in the United States also, traveling all through the New England states. And he would have used a little book like this, one of these little books that's got a timetable. I've got a piece of paper showing the one from Portland. This shows you if you want to go from Portland to Exeter, or finally it ends up, I think, in Boston. It's about a half a day by rail. So if he wanted to leave Portland at 5 in the morning, he would get to Boston by 10 minutes to 10. If on the way he wanted to stop at Haverhill, he could get to Haverhill by 8:25. That's his hometown, and so on. So Matthew would have used this little book to get around, and I managed to somehow or other find a copy of it. You may wonder how I can afford all these things. I have a small inheritance, which is gradually going down, down, down. But these aren't really investments in the sense that I'd never sell them. But I do hope that there'll be a museum someday, so I feel that this is a justifiable way to use the money. Now, this is not an original. This is a copy, but this is from a debate society in Portland, Maine. This is the anniversary program from Thursday evening, February 24, 1842. This would be not quite a year after Abby had died. And I had a strong past life hit on this. One of the city fathers, Nathaniel Deering, whom there's stuff right down here is Deering Avenue, so there's Deering everything, Deering Park. But he was a member of this club, and I know that they were friends. I know that Nathaniel Deering used to imitate Matthew's Ethan Spike, not very well, but kind of fondly imitate. He would not Ethan Spike per se, but he would create characters from Matthew's town of Hornby. So Deering admired Matthew as an author. But looking at Deering's picture, he was an older man than Matthew. I knew in here that Deering had been very, very helpful in getting Matthew through the crisis of Abby's death, that he'd mentored Matthew and took him under his wing, and that it was very personal, and that he really helped him. So I feel a tremendous love for Nathaniel Deering because of that. I think that's why he suffered, Nathaniel Deering, to write these awful tributes, But anyway, in this program, this is not full size, toward the bottom, says original poem by M.F. Whittier, a member. So we know he was a member. We know that he not only wrote poetry, but that it was good enough that the Nixian Club, which was a prestigious club, if Nathaniel Deering belonged to it, thought that his poem was good enough for him to read at their anniversary function, see? So that was the first clue I had before I found any of Matthew's poems. I knew he had to be good. He couldn't have been a versifier or a hack the way that the Whittier legacy suggests, because they never would have asked him to read his poem for their anniversary event. See, and there's not very many things happening here. We have a prayer, we have an address by P. Barnes, and there's a couple other things, and then Matthew's poem, and then a chorus, and they're out, see? So he had to be good, and indeed he was. Here's another thing I don't have an original for. It would have cost me $40,000, but this is a sampler from the Poyen family up through their son John, and then there were a couple other children born to them. This would have been Joseph Poyen and his wife Sally Elliott Poyen. It gives all the dates, and Abby is the next to last down here, and this is how I found her real birth date and her original middle name, Abigail Weld Poyen, born June 2nd, 1816. But this is a magnificent, magnificent sampler. I mean, most samplers have a little tree or an apple and the alphabet, This, I don't know if you can see this. My gosh, the foliage and the flowers and the little lakes and streams and, the willow trees and everything. So I had a past life hit on this. I said, Abby's mother was an herbalist. She knew healing herbs, and these are supposed to represent like a catalog of healing herbs, although it's not stated because it was a little bit risky. Then I found out, I think I didn't know these things when I had that impression, that she had grown up in Eliot's Tavern, which means that, a tavern is like a hospital back then. If somebody was sick and they were traveling, they would end up in the tavern and they would have to be tended to, And Sally Elliott would have learned all of these remedies from growing up in a tavern. And I asked people, are these real plants? And I got a variety of answers. Some of them said yes, some of them said no. Well, the truth is that just about every plant in existence has some medicinal properties. So it's kind of hard to nail this down. There is a willow tree down here. I mean, even I can recognize a willow tree, and these people who were kind of scoffers and naysayers wouldn't even recognize the willow tree. So that's how one's prejudice tends to interfere with, one's intellect. I'm going to turn my mic just a little bit more towards me. I'm not sure, but what it's not being blocked. There we go. Here we have photographs of both sides of Abby's family home, her father's home. Now, this is really very interesting in a particular sense. And I've told this story in one of my talks, so I don't want to go to the long version here. But the gist of it is that I couldn't find the location. I couldn't find Abby's family home anywhere. And I looked and looked and looked, and I even think Abby was trying to tell me where it is. That's another story. But I couldn't find it. Finally, my researcher went to the Haverhill Library, and a very helpful research librarian found a typewritten book which explained that the family home was sold after Abby's father died. Her mother moved to Merrimack, town of Merrimack, and sold the house to a relative, and he didn't want to keep it, so he had it split in two halves. One half was the old tavern. The other half was built around 1806 or somewhere in there. The tavern went back to the 1700s. And they split it in half, and they took the tavern and moved it up to the river, Merrimack River, and they took the larger, relatively more modern half and moved it about a mile in the other direction. Well, they had pictures of it. They had these pictures, but not these copies. And my researcher photographed them. And unfortunately, we got a little camera shake on the photograph, but this is the old one. This is what used to be Elliott's Tavern. And you can see that it's a salt box design with a sloping roof and so on. That was attached in the back. And actually, this is built with the salt box design too. So anyway, I think it was about 2 weeks afterwards, and it was like the day after Matthew's birthday. So this would have been the 19th of July. And I felt inwardly prompted by Abby to just get on the computer, and I felt like she said, just do what I prompt you to do. I'd experimented with this before and proven to my satisfaction that it could be real. I won't say it's real every time. I can say that if my mind doesn't get on a sidetrack somehow and I stay tuned in, that it can be real. So I felt that she wanted me to get on eBay. I felt that she wanted me to put in her hometown name, Rocks Village, which is in East Haverhill, Massachusetts. And I did so, and there was one listing. You can do it yourself. Get on eBay and put in Rocks Village and see if anything relevant to Abby's hometown comes up. You might find a little something, but basically I've looked for years and there's nothing ever comes up. Well, there it had 3 photographs for sale, and 2 of them were these, Abby's house. Okay. Now there is a kind of a normal explanation for that. It's not quite as weird as I thought it was initially. And that is that if the librarian got into that folder and showed my researcher those pictures, and if she saw that there were extras, then she may have taken out those extras and put them on for sale somehow, either there at the library or put them on eBay or something, so that they ended up for sale. And that accounts for the coincidence that they showed up online just at the same time, roughly, that my researcher had seen them in the library. However, I don't think I had ever looked at Rocks Village on eBay before, I had no idea why I was doing it. I just felt that Abby wanted me to do it. So it's still pretty interesting. But anyway, there they are. I physically own these. Now here's another photograph. This is from 1893. This is the collection office of the Boston Custom House, an interior shot. It says Mr. Frothingham and Mr. Locke, Boston Custom House, 1893. Well, Matthew had died 10 years earlier, but he did stints here, apparently, because one reporter writes about him there at the collections office, see? So Matthew was physically in here. Now, I had a kind of a past life hit about this because the only person that describes Matthew in the collections office is this reporter. Matthew never talks about it. He was in the naval office. So the past life hit I got was, I think that it was a rotating shift deal where people in other departments had to take turns, that nobody really wanted to do this, and everybody took turns to be in the collection department, and that Matthew happened to be taking his turn when this reporter saw him there. Not like he was there all the time, which is the way the reporter makes it sound, that that's where you can find him, you know. Well, you can find him there every couple months if his time has come around. See, that's what I think. So let's see, what else? We're getting towards the end of the stack here. This is a songbook. And I didn't just pull this out of the blue. I looked at the Dover Enquirer of 1836, 1837, when the town that Matthew and Abby eloped to, which I've also determined, it's not in the history books, but it's real clear that's what happened from a whole bunch of clues. And I pretty much determined that Matthew not only was submitting to that newspaper, the Enquirer, but that he was probably working for Mr. Wadley after his business closed. He had a business there that he launched, but it folded. And afterwards, I think he worked for Mr. Wadley, the editor. And one of the things he did was to sell books. And I noticed that there was the kind of books, very much the kind of books that Matthew would have liked. And I figured, well, he must be selling the books that he likes. But then there was a bunch of song books. And I knew that Abby was a musician and a pianist. And I said, I'll bet Abby is putting together this list. That means that she would have had some of these sheet music books. So this was one of the ones that was listed. And let's see, what's it called? This was published for many years. This one probably goes back to 36. Boston Academy's Collection, the Boston Academy's Collection. Well, I got into it and I learned to play some of those pieces. And I am absolutely certain that Abby used to play those songs and that Matthew used to love them. I can remember it intuitively and emotionally. I know which parts Matthew liked. I know which parts that they both used to like. You know, there's one in particular here. Let's see if I can find it real quick. Now that's in a different book. There's another book that has a song. Let me grab this one. This is probably, I don't think Abby ever touched this one. This is just a copy of Kingsley's Social Choir. This is volume 1. It's another one that was in the list. And there is a song in here. Take me a minute to find it. I have to be kind of careful with these. Some of them I'll play them and I'll say, that's just noodling. That's all it sounds like. This is called, it's a duet. It's called What Fairy-Like Music. And here it's attributed to J.D. Pinn. Elsewhere, I think there's a different name if you look it up. But this is like a song about a gondolier, which is to say a boatman, who sees a mermaid and hears her singing, and it entrances him. Well, I know, as sure as I'm standing here, that Matthew and Abby thought of that as like their song. They would sing it together, and it might never have been said between them, but they knew that she was the mermaid and he was the gondolier. And when they got to the end, there was a little instrumental ending on it that just sends me, you know. I know that we loved that little ending, and I can just feel what that meant to him, you know. It's very personal. I can't describe it. But this one could actually have been played by Abby herself. The reason I say that is it's a library copy. It says the property of the PSM Society, which is the Portland Sacred Music Society. And then it has a little hand pointing symbol, says not to be taken from the hall without permission from the librarian. Well, it amuses me because it's poignant, because there's no hall, there's no librarian, there's no Portland Sacred Music Society. It's all gone. But I still feel kind of guilty, you know, kind of like the towels that say do not remove this tag under penalty of law. You know, you can cut them off, but you feel kind of nervous about it. Well, there's several songs in here that I'm quite sure that Abby played, and because this came from Portland, and because Matthew and Abby lived in Portland, and because this is old enough, she could have checked this out herself and played from it. So we actually have something that Abby could have touched here. Here's the rules from the Portland Sacred Music Society. extract from library regulations, which they pasted on the front. Members of the society can have the loan of one copy of any kind of books in the library by a personal application to the librarian. Books may be returned at any regular meeting of the society, holden at their usual place of rehearsal, and no book shall be kept longer than 6 weeks. So I think Abby checked this one out. Now, while we're on the subject of Abby, I have a portrait of her, but I forgot to put it in here, so I'm going to have to carefully walk past the camera. This is an unidentified portrait of Abby at about age 20, probably in Dover, New Hampshire, probably in 1837. And it's a long story. I think she was attending a funeral of a friend, a relative of Matthew's. And this, the real one is about 2 inches high. It's a little tiny miniature. It's attributed to, and I believe it was painted by, Matthew's first cousin, Ruth Whittier Shute. She's fairly famous if you look her up. And most of her stuff is pretty primitive, but that's because her husband was doing most of the painting. They were a duo, itinerant portrait painters. She would prepare the background, and Dr. Shute would do the painting. After he died, I think it was 1836, suddenly Ruth's talents blossomed because she was a much better painter. So this is far more realistic than most of the primitive-looking pieces that you see attributed to Ruth Shute, and I think it was Samuel Shute, her husband. I saw this online. It was $4,000. There was no way I could buy it at the time. I don't know who owns it or where it is, but I got a nice copy of it from the auction website, and I keep it as a portrait. It would be wonderful if the original ends up in the library someday. I hope so. Now, let's see here. This is something I've shown before. This is a letter in Matthew's hand. It's the only one I have that I can absolutely prove is Matthew's. I have another one, or 2 or 3 other, like envelopes and one letter that I think were written by him for other people. One of them written for a fellow he worked for, Nathan Winslow. But this is Matthew's letter. It was written in the Boston Custom House, November 12, 1863, the same period that he wrote this little children's book. And all he's doing is saying that somebody thinks maybe she has a possible job for him in Washington, thinks he should move to Washington. This is the middle of the Civil War, and Washington was pretty much pro-slavery, believe it or not. And he says that he's got a terrible cold, calls it a villainous cold, and he's writing hurriedly. He says, my present impressions are that it would not be a wise step, which is hugely euphemistic, I think. It would have been extremely dangerous for him to move to. He was outed at that point as Ethan Spike. They knew who he was. See? And he says that when I see you and have all the arguments, I may think differently. In haste, always yours, M.F. Whittier, dashes it off. So, I'm now holding something that I wrote in another body. I don't get much off it. I don't really have, what do they call it? Psychometry. I don't have psychometry abilities. I can't just hold something and get vibes off it. I've tried holding it in my lap and meditating and everything else. It doesn't work like that. Either you get it or you don't get it. And I know that all I can say is that this is the handwriting that all my life I wished I had. That's about as much as I can say in the paranormal realm. So that's Matthew's letter. Now this is something else in Matthew's hand, if I'm not mistaken. Can't 100% prove it. But if I'm right, it's a very, very interesting find. This is a check. And this check was a royalty check, or an advance, for John Greenleaf Whittier, Matthew's brother, for his famous poem, Snowbound. And the check is for $500 drawn on the Second National Bank of Boston. This is January 15, 1867. And it's a signed, endorsed check. The endorsement's on the back. Somebody set this all up with a picture of John Greenleaf Whittier and everything. But this is Matthew's handwriting. And I know because you've got the word Whittier. And I can compare that with a whole bunch of Matthew's signatures that I have. This is Matthew. Now, Matthew was a bookkeeper. He did earn extra money as a bookkeeper. He had a bookkeeper's handwriting. He was in Boston at the time. He would have been connected, at least peripherally, with Ticknor and Fields. He could have been recommended by his brother. So he was moonlighting, I would say, at Ticknor and Fields. But Matthew, how can I put this? Snowbound was a fanciful, whitewashed, fairy-dusted account of their childhood in a dysfunctional family, made to look like it was a model, ideal family. It was really profoundly dishonest, I would say, although it was originally written for children. I would say if John Greenleaf Whittier was going to write a children's poem, he should not have written about himself, about his own childhood, and then whitewashed it. So he should have just written about some other family, because now it became a hit, and he was now obligated to pretend that that was really his childhood. So this whole myth developed around John Greenleaf Whittier as this sanctified fellow who had this wonderful, typical, idealized New England childhood. Well, nobody had that childhood. Very few people had that childhood, and he certainly didn't have it. So it was supposed to be dedicated to Matthew. He demurred. It was not dedicated to him after all. Snowbound, I'm talking about. And Matthew had written things that were every bit as famous, but other people were associated with it, like The Raven and The Christmas Carol. But here Matthew, who was forced, he's the water boy at Ticknor and Fields. He's forced to do their bookkeeping, and yet he has to write out this check for $500 to John Greenleaf Whittier for this bogus poem, see? So I can feel all of this, but it's very difficult to explain. It just sounds petty, Well, maybe it is and maybe it isn't. So what else? Let's see. Here we have, let's see, I'll show you the book first. This is a novel that Matthew wrote under a pseudonym which was never penetrated, nor was it ever claimed by anyone. This is called Mistake of a Lifetime, or The Robber of the Rhine Valley. It was published in 1850. It's incredibly good. This is one heck of a rollicking, complicated, psychologically deep story. And the plot goes all over the place. I think it's magnificent. It was signed with the pseudonym Waldo Howard. I know 100% sure that it's Matthew's because he used his typical Joe Strickland and Ethan Spike type Yankee dialect to protest the critics with it. And I think it's the Boston Weekly Museum, which I don't have that in front of me, but there's no question that this is Matthew's book. That by style, references, everything, dialect, everything. So it was a tremendous success in terms of sales. The critics panned it because the story was that the author, who they assumed to be this young, fledgling author, somehow convinced Frederick Gleason, the editor of Gleason's Pictorial, to pay the outrageous sum of $3,000 in 1850 money, plus royalties for this book. And the critics made fun of that. They acted like Gleason was out of his mind, off his rocker to do that. Well, I would guess that Matthew submitted it anonymously through an agent, and the agent did his job and got $3,000. But it's worth every penny, Now here I happen to have, it was serialized, see, before it was published in that final form. Well, here's one of the serialized ones. This is the second one. And so this is what it looked like when it came out in serial form. It wasn't printed in the paper. It was printed separately. Mistake of a Lifetime, or The Robber of the Rhine Valley, a story of the mysteries of the shore and the vicissitudes of the sea. And up here we have angels circling the sun. And on one side, below, we have a port scene. And on the other side, we have kind of a battle scene. And in the middle is a couple people in a rowboat. And I remember, I got a past life hit on this too. The angels are quite awkward. They're rather dumpy, worldly-looking women. They don't look like angels. And I remember Matthew thinking, well, that's the one thing that I'm not really happy with is the angels. They look like just girls that were walking down the street that the artist kind of said, come in here for a minute, you know. Other than that, I think he was extremely pleased with the whole business. That's rare. You can get copies of Mistake of a Lifetime online still. I bought 4 copies. I left at least one of them out there that you can still buy. That's about it. This I've showed you recently. This is a copy of The Rag Picker, or Bound and Free. I only found this one physical copy. Here is the dedication to Elizabeth Whittier, his sister. Of course, it doesn't name her. There's no name on this book in terms of who wrote it. George Burnham did not write this book. Now, what I'm hoping is people are still looking at my article on Academia EDU about this very thing. I wrote a paper about this book and its authorship. They're still looking at it. It was a little less yesterday. I think it was 160 something unique visitors. Today there's already 30 or 40 or something like that. People are still looking at this thing. Somebody's got to talk to a librarian. Somebody has to talk to whoever officially decides the authorship of these things. I don't know how that process is done, see? I don't know who decides and how is it done. Is it by committee? Is there some, big plush room where a whole bunch of very powerful librarians get together and vote and make a determination, But I hope that gets done. And there's going to be pressure because, the reviewer said that I made a compelling case, see? So they know I'm right about this. The question is, can it get officially changed so that, at least so there's no author, at least take it back to being anonymous the way that it was printed. If Matthew's name is not attached to it, at least get George Burnham, the con artist, get his name off of it. So I think that that's everything in my stacks here. There's plenty more. I mean, I could go on all day. I just picked out these I thought were kind of interesting. I hope you have found them interesting. If not, then perhaps people that visit the library will want to sit down for an hour and watch the long deceased Stephen Sakellarios talk to them about some of the items that are right there in the museum. There's one thing I forgot, and that is this little CDV. This is a little girl, maybe 3.5 years old. This comes from Portland, Maine. And looking up the photographer and doing some statistics, I figured out that it probably has about a 1 in 200 or something like that chance of being Matthew's daughter, Allie. This is, I talked about her when she was 7. She would be about 3. This little girl is an old soul. She's funny, she's wise, and I just get a wonderful feeling from her. When I first bought it, I said, well, it can't hurt to buy it. I just don't know, but I just feel this affinity, And I put it up on my shelf as just a cool little girl, not knowing who she was. And gradually, my feelings kind of became more articulate. And, you kind of live with something for a while and get a sense of it. Like any piece of artwork, you put it on the wall and live with it and see if you like it or not. Well, I get the same impression from her all the time. She's funny, she's wise, she's a wise little old soul, and she's just wonderful, she's just a wonderful character. And I get the same impression, every time. So there it is. I don't know how to prove it. I don't know if it could ever be proven. And as far as my statistics are concerned, I don't even remember now all that I went through. I even talked to a librarian about what the possibilities might be, and she kind of figured it out for me, statistically. I think her figure was not quite as favorable as mine, but when you take everything into account, including, who would be able to afford to have their little girl photographed at the time and who would have, the inclination, I think it was done right before Matthew went on that trip to Europe in 1851. Middle of 1851, the same time roughly that album was signed with the poem that I just shared earlier. So Matthew was getting ready to leave on a trip to Europe, and he wouldn't see her for quite some time. And he took her out to get her photograph so he would have a photograph of her. That's my guess. Because you have to take into account, what are the circumstances in which people would have their children photographed. And there's certain circumstances that are more likely, including if you're going on a long trip, things like that, or a birthday or something. So with all that taken into account, this probably has about a 1 in 200 statistical chance of being Allie. But then if you add into that my feelings, which I have proven can be accurate, sometimes objectively proven they can be accurate, that ramps it way up and makes it pretty likely that that's her.